things that mom taught me, gardening wisdom or not. So many of you may garden. I know I've been gardening most of my life, and a lot of the things that we learn as we are gardening or starting to garden, you learn from people who are teaching you. Could be an aunt, an uncle, a mom, a grandma, could be your neighbor, could be somebody at the garden center, but word of mouth gardening, handed down person to person, has been an important aspect of gardening, I think, as long as gardening has existed. And what's the deal with gardening? Why is that? You know, I think plants and humans have a really deep connection. I think this resonates probably with everybody across the globe. People grow plants. We have plant contests, like you can see. We have flower gardens, vegetable gardens, plants for a variety of purposes. And this plethora of gardening methods and reasons gives rise to a plethora of information. And so you can type in a Google search, as I'm sure you know, and find a ton of stuff. And what's wrong with all that stuff? What's wrong with this popular information about gardening? Well, nothing necessarily. But the question is anything right with it either? Depending on what you're looking for, the answer that you want, depending on where you're gardening versus where the person who wrote the answer is located, you might not get an answer that works well for you. So again, it's not that there's something wrong with popular information, something that's wrong with gardening wisdom that your mom or your aunt or whomever your uncle told you. It just means that you're not sure if it's right for you. And so again, if you tips for growing roses, Google search, you're going to get millions and millions of hits. How are you going to know if you can trust what you're seeing? How are you going to establish that cause-effect relationship of, if I fertilize, this is the result that will happen. If I prune my apple tree in a certain way, this is the result that will happen. How do you know those? How do you establish those cause and effect relationships? And one of the things we deal with as gardeners, as horticulturists, is correlation versus causation. And this goes bigger than gardening, of course, but it's one that often comes up for us in extension because things are correlated without necessarily being caused. So some examples of that, you may have seen some of these before. Were you aware that the age of Miss America correlates very strongly with the number of murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects? So you can see those moving along depending on how old Miss America is. Number of murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects tracks right along. Total revenue generated by arcades and the total number of computer science doctorates awarded in the United States. Two really tight curves. And so you wonder, what's up with that? And the question is, I suppose, is there a common factor or not? I think it's easy to say with the murders in Miss America that there's probably no relation there. This one, you might begin to wonder, okay, well, computer science arcades, I don't know if this is connected or not, but boy, look at those lines. They're right next to each other. Maybe if I own an arcade, I should start to pay attention to how many computer science students there are in earning doctorates so that I could predict my revenues. Or how about this one? Pedestrians killed in a collision with a railway train versus the precipitation in Howard County, Missouri. Or this one, money spent on pets correlating with the total revenue generated by skiing facilities. You know, of all four of these examples, I think this last one may be the most likely to share an underlying cause because if people have money to spend on luxury items like pet costumes, they're going to have money to go skiing. But there again, these two things are correlated. That doesn't mean that the amount of money that I'm spending on my pet is causing the skiing facility to make money. It means that the money earned by skiing facilities and the money spent on luxury items are both responding to the same underlying factor. And those, that's a correlation, not a causation. So there's something interesting here perhaps, but it may not be what we think. So how on earth do you know if something is a cause, if something's correlated, or if something's just dumb luck, as in the case of Miss America and murder? And the answer to how you know that is that you conduct an experiment. And given that many of us don't have the time or materials to conduct a lot of experiments at home, you trust the folks who have conducted experiments, or you trust the folks that have access to the data from those experiments and those results to be able to make recommendations in your area. Of course, I would recommend that you contact your local extension office to get started. Oftentimes, if you're looking for something quick though, who doesn't turn to Google? And so if you don't already know this little Google trick, if you take nothing else away, I would say take this from this talk. In Google, you can use site restricting operators. And that means if you were to type site:/edu with no spaces, or site:/gov, or site:/com, any of those site abbreviations that indicate what type of website something is, Google will restrict your search answers to those websites. And so if you search roses, site:/edu, you will get pages that mention roses that are housed on .edu domain names. That's going to be a lot of extension information. Now, you still have to do some critical thinking about that, because rose information that's written for gardeners in New Jersey might not apply for gardeners in Colorado, but it at least will get you to places that should be research supported. Again, don't believe everything you read, even if it's from a site edu. If they're recommending something for gardeners on the East Coast, might not apply to you here. And certainly that changes when you start looking at Instagram influencers or YouTube videos. There's a lot of misinformation out there, some of it intentional, some of it not. And then lastly, and this goes, this is a caution as much for me as an extension agent as it is for you, is not to over extrapolate information from your experiments. And so just because an experiment has been run or data exists doesn't mean that you can support the conclusions broadly. So one of the ways this gets used in gardening a lot is experiments are done in an agricultural field where you've got hundreds of acres cultivating one crop. Something works there and people will take it whole cloth and try to apply it to a residential landscape. And that does not always work. So let's get down to brass tacks and talk about some of these things that you might have heard, that I might have heard growing up, still here at garden centers, from landscapers, from your neighbor. First one, weed fabric is permanent, easy weed control. The rationale, of course, is this breathable fabric allows air and water through, but not weeds. You cover up that fabric with wood chip or rock mulch, as you see here in the photo, wood mulch going in over wood fabric in a residential landscape. Just makes it look a little nicer and will prevent that weed fabric from breaking down. So let's roll out that gray carpet and start mixing up drinks, because we don't have to pull weeds anymore. So Cassie, if you'd launch the first poll, this is going to be a bit of an interactive talk. Go ahead and click what y'all think for this one. There are 2 questions. And it's completely anonymous. So your name is not associated with your answer. I'm not going to save these. It's just something fun for us to do as we go through the presentation. And I can't see it, Cassie, but did the poll go?
Yes, it's going. We're at about 80%.
Sweet. I'm bummed that I can't see it.
It is slowing down. I will see. Yep, it looks like we've pretty much slowed to a stop. So I'm going to end and share for everybody.
Okay. And then if you could say what the results are, because I can't see it.
Yes, of course.
And if anybody's called in, they won't be able to see it either.
Yeah. Question number 1 is, have you heard of this myth? And 73% said yes. 19% said not this one, but something similar. So most people have heard this concept. Question number 2, what do you think? 2% said that they agree that it's a permanent easy weed control. 27%, I'm not sure. And 71%, not a chance.
All right, thank you. All right, folks, well, let's see. Well, it depends on the time scale. Weed fabric works in the short term, but in almost all cases, these fabrics are only as effective for a short period of time because those pores start to clog up with dirt. And so it no longer allows air and water to move through the weed fabric. And so you start to starve the roots of your desirable plants. And then of course, in the dirt that collects on the top, weeds germinated. So you can see here a very happy little weed that lost its leaves as I was trying to pull it. There it is, rooted into and through the weed fabric. And so you can see it perhaps didn't work as well as we had hoped in that case. Here you can see again on the left, this is smooth brome. It's a weedy grass species. It's pretty common in Colorado. It's used as a pasture grass, but also shows up in home landscapes often as a weed, growing right through that weed fabric. And in fact, this is one where the weed fabric was laid, you can see next to a lawn that had weedy brome, that weedy smooth brome in it. Smooth brome grows under the fabric and then just pokes its way right through it. So it can't actually stop it. And then on the right, you can see, this is one of my least favorite things about weed fabric. You can see how wet this photo looks, how shiny everything is. So the weed fabric is there on the right. And then as you move to the left across, you see a brown layer and then a really kind of greenish gray layer of soil. And in Colorado, if you've got greenish gray soil, that tends to indicate low oxygen conditions. Because if soil has good oxygen in Colorado, especially, tends to turn reddish because of all the iron that's in our soil. So that greenish condition, again, showing lack of oxygen due to the amount of water that constantly sits in this soil. And the water is sitting in that soil because the weed fabric is preventing the water from flowing further down into the ground. And so it's a great way to prevent water flow into the soil. People use it underneath pathways for that reason. But not great at letting air and gas exchange through so that the roots of the plants that you actually want are able to get those things. So I say skip the fabric and mulch appropriately. You could have this delightful weed fabric landscape on your left, or you could have something like on the right, very similar growing conditions here, one with weed fabric, one without. Obviously I cherry picked these pictures, but I hope that the data that I showed support that those research studies of weed fabric, that it doesn't actually work in permanent landscapes. So you may be wondering, well, how on earth did we even get to this weed fabric? Why is it so popular? Why is it sold? And it is the prime example, in my opinion, of agricultural techniques being inappropriately applied in home landscapes. Weed fabric works great in the short term, as you saw, and in an agriculture situation, you would roll this out between your crop rows, you'd put your crops in, you wouldn't bother with mulch because you're just growing crops here trying to make money. And then at the end of the year, you roll it up and you throw it away and you replace it every single year. That's something that is not practical or appropriate in a home landscape. And so here you have, again, the inappropriate application of an agricultural technique to permanent residential landscapes. So don't do it. Stop buying that weed fabric. Stop using that weed fabric. Use mulch instead. All right, next one. Colorado soil is lousy. So here you can see two quotes that I pulled directly from the internet. One's from a video, one's from a blog. Amend soil with manure and compost to increase fertility, drainage, and fluffiness. And then, of course, growing anything in Colorado is quite a challenge, even for a seasoned gardener. All right, so if you want to go ahead and launch the next poll, please, Cassie.
Done.
So the same two questions. Go ahead and let us know what you think.
Oh, they're coming in speedy this time.
All right.
So it looks like we're starting to slow down a little bit. Nope, maybe a couple more coming in. Question number one, have you heard this one? Oh, actually, let me give it another moment. Make sure it looks like it's stopped. I'll end and I will share the results so everyone can see. Have you heard this one? 83% of you, yes. 11% no, 7% not this, but something similar. What do you think? 20%, it's terrible. 74%, this feels like a trick question. And 7%, it's wonderful.
All right. Well, for those of you that asked if it was a trick question or felt like it was a trick question, boy, you're right. You're on to me. And so I think one of the red flags, if you hear something like Colorado soil is lousy, should be, all right, well, Colorado soil. Colorado's a big place. And so if you look here at this picture, this is just about 100,000 acres between Highlands Ranch and Castle Rock in Douglas County. It's my home county. And all those little orange lines are indicating differences in soil. And they're actually in that space between Douglas County, or within Douglas County, between Castle Rock and Highlands Ranch, along both sides of I-25, which is that vertical red line you see passing through the diagram. There are 54 unique geologic soil types. And so saying, and that's just one tiny patch of Colorado. We've got a lot of different soil types. And so this, just the phrase Colorado soil should be raising a giant red flag with you if somebody says that Colorado soil is bad. The best thing that I can tell you to do is you should get a soil test so you know what kind of soil you have. And you're not gonna fight the geology where you are. So what your soil type, that parent soil that you have, you're not gonna fight it. The other thing to bear in mind, though, is that this diagram with all those orange lines is showing what the native soil is like. Again, if you live in an urban or a suburban area, someplace that's been developed, your soil is more likely to look a little something like this, where it's been excavated, compacted, stuff's been brought in, it's been mixed completely as they've built your house. And a lot of that soil compaction around your house is needed because you don't want your house to fall down. And a lot of it is, fill dirt and maybe some practices that could be improved. But chances are you're not gardening with your native soil. You're gardening with, at best, an approximation of it, and at worst, a real compacted mess, which is why, again, it's important that you get that soil test so that you know what you're dealing with. It also makes a huge difference to know what you're growing. Plants are diverse. What are your plans? So, if you want to have a flower border of annuals like you see here on the left, then yes, you're going to need something that is fertile, a high organic matter. And when I say high organic matter, I'm talking like 5%. Lots of people, when you go to amend soil, you aim for 20, 30, 40% organic matter. You don't need that much. Peat bogs have 20% organic matter. And aim for about 5% organic matter. If you're in a vegetable cultivation or cut flowers, annual, something you're removing every year, you may need to continue to add organic matter to maintain that 5%. But if you're planning to grow xeriscape, native grasses, perennials of any kind, you're not going to need to be constantly adding organic matter to those beds. And then this picture on the right, this picture was taken at about 10,000 feet in elevation. And that soil is not deep. It's not very much soil before you hit rocks, and I see a lot of plants. And so knowing what your soil is like will help you choose plants that will grow well. And conversely, knowing what you want to grow will help you make any modification to your soil that you might need. But bear in mind with soil modification that it's not a simple solution. It's not, once and done, super easy. Again, the biggest challenge that most gardeners face in Colorado in a suburban or an urban area is compaction, just from the construction process. And compaction takes a while to overcome. And it doesn't matter if you've got clay or clay loam or sand or any of the combinations of soil types. If you've compacted it, you have pushed the soil particles really close together, leaving limited space for air and water, which roots need to be able to grow well. So over time, you can fight compaction by re-aggregating some of the soil particles into more complex particles called PEDs. This is a really complex process though, and it's geologic in scale, both in terms of size and time. And it's primarily a physical process that is also moderated by chemistry, but that chemistry is not as simple as adding a bag of gypsum, as you see here, conditioner for clay soil, but it's something that's mediated by living organisms, like plant roots, like fungus, like microbes. And just a quick word on gypsum. You'll hear often, and this is a local garden center here. You can see more than one gypsum or lime product on the site here, on the shelves. Gypsum works if you have salt in your soil to a level that it is preventing plant growth. So what they would call sodic soils. So much salt in your soil that you can't grow anything, then you're going to want to add gypsum. Gypsum will not break up clay soil. And so if you have clay or compacted soil, adding gypsum is not the answer. All right, moving along to companion planting, because plants are team players. Ready when you are, Cassie? Launch the poll, please.
We are launched. Coming in very rapidly. We're almost, I think this is the most votes we've gotten so far.
All right.
We've got 81% of folks voted and an overwhelming, let me end and share because it stopped and slowed down. Have you heard of companion planting? 90% said yes.
Right.
Does it work? 45%, you bet. 53% sometimes, and 2% not on your life.
All right. Well, moving along. This one was kind of a trick again. You'll see that pattern with me. And you're probably all right, because companion planting is what they call a pancrustan, which is a new word I learned that I'm excited about. You can see it there. And that is a hypothesis or a topic that is so general to be actually useless in describing what it might mean. That's similar to natural on food packaging. It's not regulated, means different things to different people, rendering it therefore about meaningless. The most common ideas of companion planting come from this idea of balanced nature, that everything, if you just find the right combination, you're gonna have a restoration of paradise, right? That everything's gonna work just great and the plants are gonna grow super well next to each other. And that can happen, but the fact is that plants growing near each other can have simultaneous positive and negative effects because you have two living things, both of which have their own goals and both of which may benefit or may harm their neighbors. And so rather than looking for a blanket solution, consider a problem you're trying to solve and then look for solutions that might involve companion planting, if you will, or using plant ecology to your advantage. So, for example, you could use competition as a way to outcompete weeds in your property. And so I know people that do this with vigorous vining crops, pumpkins and winter squash, for example, can shade out bindweed. Competition can be bad as well, though. So if you look at this photograph here, you see that unbelievably gigantic datura and some rather long-suffering perennials around it. And one of the reasons that those perennials near it might not be doing so well is because that monster in the middle is getting all the water and nutrients. There's great evidence that companion plants or a diverse crop of plants can attract beneficial insects to your flower or vegetable gardens. There's a great body of research behind cover crops and green manure, alternate hosts, trap crops for pest management. I guess the point, again, is that plants near other plants will interact for sure. Whether the interaction is as positive or negative depends on a lot of different factors, including soil, climate, and the plants themselves, because ultimately you are looking at ecology on a small scale. And to quote one of my ecology professors from way back when, remember that ecology is not rocket science, it's harder. Meaning only that there are so many factors that are contributing to those relationships among living organisms that it's pretty hard to dial down onto one. This is another one of the reasons that there's not a lot of research out there behind some of these companion planting concepts. It's just really hard to design a good experiment to explore that sort of thing. All right, next up, add eggshells to your garden soil to prevent blossom end rot. All right, Cassie, when you're ready.
We're ready. We're getting answers.
Excellent.
Oh, for a little bit there, we were at 100% for people having heard it. Okay, I think we've got most of our folks responding. It hasn't ticked up for a moment or two, so I'm going to end and share. So for this one, we've got 60% of folks have heard it, another 10% have heard something similar, and 30% have not heard it.
Right.
In terms of what folks think, 2% works like a charm, 71% are not sure, and 27% it doesn't work. So that's a little bit less consistent than we've had so far.
All right, yeah. So this one may be losing some steam, and that's a good thing because it's true that calcium deficiency is associated with blossom end rot, but it's a pretty complicated situation. But let's start with just looking at calcium. So let's assume that blossom end rot is caused by calcium deficiency. Remember that we're not sure about that. Colorado soil in general, all of those various types of soil, because of the age of our land in our state, for the most part, we got tons of calcium. We got so much calcium, we got towns named gypsum, which is a mineral that contains calcium. We got all kinds of calcium. We don't need extra calcium. Furthermore, the calcium in eggshells is not readily available. They take a while to decompose. And then last, calcium availability in the plant itself depends on things other than the amount of calcium that's in the soil. One of those is water within the plant. The plant needs good water flow in order to move calcium, especially into its young growing portions, which is where you would see blossom end rot developing. Areas of rapid cell expansion like fruit ends or growing tips of the plant. Plant needs a lot of water, well, not a lot of water, but enough water, I should say, in order to move calcium to those vital places. Furthermore, blossom end rot is not so simple as just a calcium deficiency. It includes environmental factors like temperature, water availability, and salinity that provides or apply stress to the plants. Physiological characters within the plants, like how calcium is distributed, again, partly of that depending on water, reactive oxygen species, which are caused again by stress, membrane leakiness, and then genetics. Some plants are more susceptible than others. And so I show you on the right here this really complicated diagram, not so that you could study it and learn it, but just as an indication that this is a complicated disease. So this diagram came from a paper you see there cited in 2019, a literature review of everything we currently know about blossom end rot. There's a fair amount of research out there about blossom end rot because it affects a multiple of crops, not just tomatoes, but many economically important crops, including tomatoes. So people are interested in this. And you can see all of those proposed factors that could be leading in and contributing to the development or the prevention of blossom end rot. Not as simple as calcium, and certainly not helped by eggshells. We got all kinds of calcium. You don't need to add it. Get that soil test if you're wondering and see how much calcium you have, but my money's on you've got plenty of calcium. All right, clicking through these now. These get more and more fun, in my opinion, as we go on. We'll see if you all agree. Plants grow better if you talk to them because plants are like people and they appreciate encouragement. All right, Cassie?
We're working through.
And
oh, lots of rapid votes on this one.
the question about this plant for me in the photograph is if somebody just didn't talk to it or if someone was being rude to that plant to make it look so forlorn.
All right, it looks like our polling is pretty much stopped, so I'm going to end and share. Looks like we're pretty unanimous. People, about 90% of people have heard this one, and 8% have heard something similar.
All right.
And question number 2, what do you think? 39%, excellent, talk to their plants every day. I'm putting my bias in there. 31% don't have that kind of time, and 29% plants don't have ears. So almost evenly split there.
All right. Well, this is again where the jury's kind of out. What is without question true is that plants respond to sound, despite the fact that they don't have ears. I'm recognizing now that in my poll question, you know, well, that should have been 100% because I think we can all agree that plants don't have ears. Thankfully, you all understood what I meant. So here you can see the photograph here of A and B. These are Arabidopsis seedlings. Arabidopsis is the white lab rat of the plant world. And it was grown in two conditions. On the left, just normally on that nutrient plate. On the right, plate B, it was grown with a speaker providing sound in the direction of the red arrow. So behind that red arrow, there was a speaker playing sound at those plants. And you can see very clearly that those plants responded to the sound and they grew towards it. You'll also notice anatomically that those roots look a little bit different than the roots on the left, where they don't have as many lateral branches and they're actually a bit shorter too. So something is definitely going on there. Now, why that's happening, we don't know. It has been shown experimentally that sound waves do affect membrane permeability in plants, can affect growth rate and direction, as we see here in the photo, and can affect the plant's internal chemistry, the number and types of nutrient ions that are available, number and types of plant hormones that are there. So plants definitely respond to sound. But do they respond to talking? Well, how loudly do you speak? All of the experiments with sound in plants have tested sounds between 80 and 100 decibels. That's somewhere between a lawnmower and a motorcycle. And the sounds have been anywhere from several hours of application to several days of application of continuous sound. As a reference, normal conversation, quite a bit quieter than that, about 100 times quieter than a lawnmower at 60 decibels. And so that's not to say that talking, the volume of talking doesn't do anything, but it is to say that all of the experimental evidence that shows that plants respond to sound have been done or have been collected using sounds that are not anything like human conversation. There are some out there that say, you know, bird song or the sound of flapping bird wings can also make a difference. Again, maybe they can, but the experimental evidence so far that shows that plants respond to sound is much louder sound than human conversation. However, certainly an interesting study or interesting topic for further study. So this is one I'd say, you know, if talking to your plants helps you sleep at night, I'd say go ahead and keep talking to them. We also don't know what the effect of all that sound could be. You know, we know that plants are impacted by sound. We don't know if that's positive or negative. We don't know, for example, how this tree feels about the conversation that it may be having with the person sitting next to it. We just know that it's probably perceiving it in some fashion. All right, next, deep root watering is a great way to give your trees some extra TLC. Launching the poll.
Poll is launched.
Excellent. And then, of course, my favorite quote that I found on the internet about this, you'll see there is tree experts recommend watering and fertilizing below the soil surface where most of the active tree roots grow. And that's my favorite because it's most of the active tree roots, not all of the active tree roots.
All right, looks like we're almost to our usual number of respondents. It looks okay, so it hasn't ticked up since I started talking. I'm going to end and share the results. 83% said yes, they have heard this one, and 12% not exactly, but similar, with only 6% not having heard it. Question number 2, 52% say that it is better. 21% say not sure, 27% say it's not better, and no one said that it's worse.
All right, excellent. Well, good. This is another one that, you know, deep root watering is almost approaching that same level as companion planting, where it means so many different things that it's hard to say. You need to know more detail about what the person is proposing to know whether or not it's beneficial or not. I show you this tree diagram here because this is a common perception about how trees grow. Essentially, you can see those roots going down. Look how deep and what a fibrous network deep down of roots that tree has, that figurative tree has. And that is in fact not how tree roots grow. Most tree roots are in the top couple feet of soil. And you've seen this if you've ever seen a tree blown over. If you've ever been digging in your yard, you've run across these tree roots. So this is after a big rainstorm, which is why you see that puddle there underneath the tree. It's not growing over some weird hard pan of soil that caused the roots to be this way. And you can see there, maybe 2 feet of soil, maybe, that came up with that tree and that plate of roots as it blew over. Because again, most of the roots are in those top 2 feet of soil. The big structural roots might go deeper if conditions allow. Those conditions, again, as we mentioned in the soil compaction discussion, are oxygen and water availability. They're there to really anchor that tree. But the feeder roots, the roots that are doing the bulk of the heavy lifting of absorbing water and nutrients for that tree, are in the top 6 to 12 inches of soil. They're close to the surface because that's where the water and the nutrients are. The nutrients being generated by the turnover of organic matter at the soil surface, and then rain, which is how precipitation is coming in most natural systems. Those feeder roots are regularly replaced. They cycle around quite a bit. And so they're up there with your turf grass roots. They're up there in your flower garden with those flower garden roots, because those roots expand as widely as the tree is tall. The tree has roots where it needs to get those resources. And so save your time, get out the sprinkler, because that tree is going to be able to absorb the water that's applied to the soil surface. Now, the caveat there is that you might consider deep root watering. If by deep root watering, you mean putting the water to a depth of 6 to 12 inches over a wide area, so that that widespread of feeder roots can access it. And the one advantage of doing that would be to prevent surface evaporation. That's a lot of work. You could also surface apply water slowly with a bubble hose or a low sprinkler at night and when it's not windy, similar to how you would water your lawn, in order to eliminate those evaporative losses. So probably not worth the investment to inject water 6 inches into the soil when you could just water it like you water your lawn, taking into account what you might lose from evaporation. There is certainly no reason to inject water or fertilizer deeper than the top foot of soil, because you're putting it beyond the reach of even the tree. All right, these last two are just some of my very favorites. If ants don't walk on your peonies, they won't open. I grew up with this one. I just was outside checking my peonies this morning and there are ants on them, so I'm feeling really good about this. What do you all think?
This one's a little bit evenly split so far. Watching the numbers tick up, still going. All right. I think we've hit an end. I'll share results. A little closer to evenly split here in terms of question number one. Have you heard this one? 40% have heard it, 8% have heard something similar, and 51% have not heard this one.
All right. All right, yeah, that is a good split. And for those folks who have heard it, well, I guess for everybody, what do we think? Is it real or not real?
So question number two, what do you think? 12% said ant feet are required, 29% said not sure, and 59% said ant feet are not required.
All right, well, 59% of you are correct. Ant feet are not required. And yet ants are constantly walking around on the peonies. What is up with that? Well, it has to do with a plant anatomical feature called an extrafloral nectary. Extrafloral just meaning outside the flower. And a nectary is a gland on the flower that is producing the nectar. And many plants, not just peony, produce nectar at these extrafloral nectaries for purposes outside that of direct pollination. we're not entirely sure on all plants what the extrafloral nectaries are doing, but we know they're not helping with pollination because they're nowhere near the pollen. So peonies have these extrafloral nectaries on the sepals of their flower. One of the hypotheses is that they're there in order to attract things like ants in order to help defend those flowers from pests that might come to try to eat the flowers. Now, you may be familiar with the fact that ants will protect aphids because aphids are producing honeydew. So this would be one if an aphid showed up on a peony. I'm not sure what the ants would do. Probably just harvest the nectar from everything. But if something else were to come, some grazing or browsing insect to chew on that peony, the ants would defend the peony because it's their food source. You can see here on the right, extrafloral nectaries on a cherry tree at the base of the leaf. Again, not sure exactly what the plant is doing with those, but we know that it is not directly involved with pollination. If your peonies aren't flowering and you haven't seen any ants on them, because we know it doesn't have to do with ants, here are some things that you might consider. The first one is it might be time to divide or lift that peony because the eyes are too deep. The eyes of the peony refer to the growing tips that will make above ground shoots. So in this photograph, you can see, can you see my cursor, Cassie?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so right here where I'm circling, there's an eye. Here's an eye up here. Here's an eye. Those buds are going to be making the above ground portions of the plant. If those are more than an inch or so deep, oftentimes the plant won't have the ability to flower. And so make sure that you're not planting your peonies too deeply. It might not be getting enough sun. Maybe you planted that peony next to a young tree and now the tree is bigger, so it's getting too much shade. So consider moving it. And then of course, it might be fertilizer, but there's an asterisk there because fertilizer could in fact be the problem if you are applying a fertilizer that's high in nitrogen, which tends to be the nutrient that's limiting in Colorado, but too much nitrogen could cause a lot of foliar growth and not a lot of flowers. And I would recommend in that case, make sure you get a soil test to see what's deficient. Don't just run out there for the bloom booster fertilizer because bloom booster fertilizers typically contain a lot of phosphorus. Typically, phosphorus is not required in the average landscape residential. And if you add too much phosphorus, you could cause nutrient imbalances with other nutrients. And so before you run out for the bloom booster, get a soil test. And if it's a nitrogen issue, just don't give it as much nitrogen and it should respond. All right, we saved my favorite one for last. And this is one that I've wondered about for most of my life, and I finally know the answer to it. If you cut a worm in half, you get 2 worms. What do y'all think?
Starting to get our answers piling in. All right, I think we've got about as many people as we're usually having answer. We've got for question number 1, 83% said yes, they have heard it, 4% something similar, and 13% have not heard this one. Question number 2, what do you think? 33% said you get 2 worms. 29% said not sure. Nobody thought that there would be 3 worms. And 38% said you get fewer than 2 worms.
All right, well, let's see. If you cut a worm in half, you get a dead worm. My favorite quote from Deanne Presley of the Western Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. Now, that's not entirely true. But that is largely true, especially about the earthworms that you are likely to run across. But earthworms, which that term earthworm responds to a variety of species. Within night crawlers or the European earthworm, which was what most of us think of when we hear earthworm, the capacity to regenerate is somewhat variable. And it depends on which end you snip, how much gets snipped, and then of course, site conditions. And people have been wondering about this ability of earthworms to regenerate for a long time. And so you'll notice one of the citations there is from 1885, where Adele Field did some worm dissections over the winter in order to amuse herself and found that if you cut the front end of the worm, it can regenerate in ideal conditions, sort of in a lab. back end of the worm typically won't. As people have explored this further, it's been determined that it really depends on how intact the nervous system is. So you can snip off the head of the worm, which is this end here, up to 5 segments, and it'll grow a new head, which includes a new brain and a new mouth. You can cut pretty close to the worm all the way up to the clitellum, which is this reproductive structure here. And you'll get a new worm, oftentimes shorter. It's not always, won't always regenerate to the same length, but part of it depends on site conditions. And this is where you get to this quote from Deanne Presley. If you cut a worm in half, you get a dead worm. Because typically in conditions that are in the field, they're just not right for that worm to regenerate from something as dramatic as being sliced right in half by the shovel. Much more likely to be able to regenerate if that worm has just part of it damaged by, say, a bird or a mole or something like that. It certainly wouldn't be a mole in most parts of our state, but some predator or another. But for something as dramatic as complete bisection, it's not likely. If you were wondering, as I was, here's a schematic of what would happen. There are lots of science projects in this. If you can convince somebody that they should slice some worms for the posterity of science. Again, if you do this in a protected environment, the worms are pretty likely to succeed in regenerating. So you can see if you cut the worm in half, there's the clitellum, there's the head, you get this blastema, which is a group of cells that de-differentiate and start to take on new roles. And they'll heal up that wound and then regenerate the segments. And so you can see there the regenerated segments. It's a much shorter worm for now, but those segments start off smaller and then eventually will expand and grow. And so the worm can regain its original length. It's just going to take it a while. Now, this particular capacity for worms to do this has been interesting, not only because it's sort of curious and unique, but because it has the potential to help with wound healing. How is it that these cells are de-differentiating and so quickly closing up? Such a dramatic wound is being cut completely in half. There are actually experiments out there that have demonstrated that wounds in mice heal more quickly when treated with earthworm extract. And in fact, earthworms have been used in traditional medicine from a number of cultures for this exact reason. So if you cut yourself in some traditional medicines, you would quickly treat that cut with earthworms in order to help it heal up. And there's some scientific basis and evidence in that. So you might get one worm if you cut that worm in half, as you can see here, but you're not going to get 2 worms. That tail end is unlikely to be able to regenerate, even if it's a good chunk. So at best, you'll have 1 worm in the field. Chances are, if you cut that worm in half, you'll get a dead worm. All right, so that ends the official questions I wanted to talk about today with you. Thanks for joining me. Again, if you've got other questions, we've got a little bit of time now. I'm happy to talk about them. But whenever a question strikes you about gardening or landscaping, natural resources, call up Extension, because it is why we're here.